Good evening, everyone. I'm Louise Mirror, President and CEO of the New York Historical Society, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you back to the History Hour. Tonight's program is titled The Art of War, A Painter's Eye View. As always, I want to take just a moment to thank our trustees, our Chairman's Council, our members, and all of our supporters who have joined us this evening. We truly do appreciate your support. Just a few words now about our speakers. Valerie Paley, our moderator this evening, is Vice President and Chief Historian at New York Historical. She is also Director of our Center for Women's History. Harold Holzer is the winner of the 2015 Gilder Lehrman Lincoln Prize and one of the nation's leading authorities on Abraham Lincoln and the political culture of the Civil War era. He's the author of numerous books on those subjects, including The Civil War in 50 Objects, on which this program is based. I'd like to thank you once again for joining us. And now I hand it over to Valerie and Harold.
Thank you, Louise. And good evening and welcome. Tonight, we're going to talk about The Art of War, A Painter's Eye View. But first, I want to remind everyone that tonight's program, which is being recorded, will last approximately 45 minutes, including 15 minutes for questions and answers. As always, we ask that you submit your questions via the Q&A function on your Zoom screen. You can submit questions at any time during the talk. We will answer as many as possible toward the end of the program. And remember, we have disabled the chat function, so you will want to use the Q&A button instead. So, we're continuing our conversation in this series that argues that objects have the power to convey historical events and to help us understand the past. This idea inspired Harold Holzer's book, The Civil War in 50 Objects, the objects of which were taken from the collections of the New York Historical Society. This evening, we will be looking at 5 objects from the book and related exhibition grouped around the theme of the art of war. So these works are all very different and have very different background stories. We have the return of the 69th Irish Regiment, caricature of Lincoln writing the Emancipation Proclamation, The Lincoln Family by Carpenter, Victor Nailing's painting, An Episode of War, and some prison art. So first, let's look at the relationship between war and art, Harold. Did war stimulate art in America, and did art change the romantic image of war?
Yeah, I think both, Valerie, and good evening. Thanks for having me back. I think the great emphasis of American painting up to the Civil War was probably history painting and landscape painting. Portraiture continued in much the same way. Of course, it took on a martial air with all the military heroes who were portrayed. But it sent many more artists into the field or near the field to the camp. Soldiers like soldier artists proliferated. Artists like Winslow Homer went to the field to do sketches for the weekly newspapers and evolved into very successful artists. But in terms of what it did to landscape painting, it totally revolutionized the romantic attitude artists had toward this so-called American Eden, the pristine landscape of the Americas. And the landscape was ravaged by gunfire and the land was stained by blood. So it really changed the way this great American art form was recorded during and after the war. And of course, the war kept artists busy for many years after the war on commissions from military lodges, armories, and the United Daughters of the Confederacy, and all these patrons that kept clamoring for pictures and statues, as we know.
And statues, as we know. Well, let's start with our first object or painting of the evening, and that is Louis Lang's Return of the 69th Irish Regiment, NYSM, from the Seat of War. This was painted in 1862. You call this huge painting, it's 7 by 11 feet, so it is very huge, a masterpiece of 19th century public relations. Why?
Well, it made great heroes of a military unit that fought pretty well, but in the end unsuccessfully, as did all the Union troops at the Battle of Bull Run. But this was important for morale because it was the Irish Brigade of New York, the unit that Robert E. Lee later nicknamed the Fighting 69th in admiration. But in its early permutation, it was recruited, and it was very important to the Union war effort that German Americans and Irish Americans who had different political points of view were both recruited and both raised their own regiments. And this one went off very early in the war, in the spring of 1861, down to Virginia, established itself in Arlington Heights, where they all built fortifications for Washington. It was very Irish. I mean, Colonel Corcoran, who was the commander, had a minister, a Catholic priest, sprinkle holy water on the first cannon at Fort Corcoran, named in his honor, and they marched off very proudly to war. Corcoran was Irish-born. He was 33 years old, member of the Fenian Brotherhood. So lots of.
We have an image, a detail of Corcoran.
Well, that's not going to be Corcoran, so we shouldn't get to it yet.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Okay.
Sorry. Okay. Yes. Why don't we?
I should point out, this fellow is not Corcoran, because at the Battle of Bull Run itself, where our Irish regiment fought very bravely, Corcoran was captured by the Confederates, and he remained in prison for a full year. When he was finally released, Abraham Lincoln gave him and other officers who had been imprisoned a state dinner in the White House. But when the Union, these early recruits only were for 90 days. So
and Corcoran was there for a whole year in prison, right? Yes, exactly.
Yeah, well, he was an exception. But after 90 days, the Fighting 69th fought no more. They came back, or at least this unit, came back in a ship to Battery Park. And this is what this scene depicts. And the fellow waving his hat is Corcoran's successor, Thomas Francis Meagher, Meagher, and there he is, getting a hero's welcome in lieu of Michael Corcoran. But and these portraits were painted of actual individually recognized people in the Irish American community. And obviously,
the 69th saw combat, as you said, in the Battle of Bull Run in 1861 as part of a brigade that was actually commanded by William T. Sherman. What happened to them there?
Well, they did okay. I mean, they did well. They were brave. But again, the Battle of Bull Run was won by the Union in the morning. The only problem is that the afternoon came after the morning, and the Confederates charged back and won the day. So it was a huge embarrassment, especially when these guys demobbed, having done no more than participate in what turned out to be a real disaster.
Yes, but they did receive quite an unexpected welcome when they arrived in Manhattan a week later. What sort of things does Louis Lang depict in the painting?
Well, you could see the crowd surging around Meagher. And here, this is my favorite detail because I've written so often about popular prints. This is an image of a newsboy selling engravings or lithographs of Colonel Corcoran, who was back suffering in a prison camp. So he was a particular hero. And, they came back, and the brigade was smart enough and wealthy enough to commission this, as you point out, Val, a humongous painting.
Huge.
And it was displayed. It was intended, I think, for their Essex Street Armory. After this scene, they all marched to Essex Street, on the Lower East Side, and stacked their arms. And we don't know where this painting ultimately wound up, but it did have a great display at the Nerdler Gallery on 9th Avenue, and was, won rave reviews from the critics. So it was pretty famous in its day.
So, but it ultimately became a bit of an artistic curiosity. Why?
Well, 2 years after this scene, the city erupted in draft riots, as we discussed in an earlier program, and so many Irish and Irish Americans participated that it became kind of politically incorrect to celebrate the early Irish American contributions to the Union war effort. So this painting just deteriorated, and thank goodness Louis Lang donated it to the Historical Society 25 years after this scene. And the great thing is that when it was finally discovered in storage, it was restored magnificently in time for exhibition in the Civil War in 50 Objects.
Absolutely. Yes, and it was found in tatters. It's a great feat of conservation to pull it together and make it one gorgeous unit, which is on the 4th floor in our Blues Center. Please come and see it when we reopen. Let's move now to our next painting object, and that is The Lincoln Family in 1861 by Francis Bicknell Carpenter. Now, this is in black and white, so it has a photographic kind of quality to it, even though it's oil on canvas, but there are no photographs of the Lincoln family altogether. Why?
We really don't know, but Mary Lincoln did not like to be photographed, and she did not like to be photographed with her husband, the myth says, because she was so much shorter that she thought she looked doll-like and didn't like the comparison between them. They were never photographed together.
She was a little bit fatter too.
Well, not in this picture, and I'll explain that. But so Lincoln was photographed with Tad. This is a riff on that famous photograph. And as you say, this is painted in black and white for a very simple reason, and gray, because it's a preparatory piece to serve as a model for a popular print. So Carpenter didn't bother to add color because it would have not been reproduced in an engraving.
It's interesting because there's such public interest these days, and actually in the last century, artistic depictions of the first family, but not in this time and place. And right. That only sort of became more the thing after Lincoln's assassination. But in any case, that's where this painting comes in. Tell us more about this and its artist, Francis Bicknell Carpenter.
So Carpenter was a New Yorker from upstate New York, Homer, New York, near Syracuse, but he had a gallery in New York City, and he decided he wanted to paint the first reading of the Emancipation Proclamation before the cabinet. And he got letters of introduction. He went to the White House. It's a pretty open season. Lincoln liked him. He let him work there for 6 months. But while he was there, he made sketches of the family, and he commissioned the famous photograph of Lincoln and Tad looking at this photograph album that looked very much like a Bible, and no one ever corrected that impression because it was. And then in 1865, Lincoln, of course, dies. Carpenter is still working on his emancipation engraving. The painting is done, and he's pretty well known. So he goes to a New York engraver, J.C. Derby, and he works with another publisher, J.C. Buttra, to do a Lincoln family. And Carpenter's price is $500, which is a pretty good fee. But he decides to write to Mary Lincoln, who's his buddy at this point, and she suggests all of the other models. This handsome picture of Robert, who was then at Harvard, a picture of Willie, who died in 1862. He's the middle child holding the sword, and that's why it's very specifically the family in 61. And when Carpenter suggests a Mary, she suggests one that was taken before she gained weight. So she's the one who chose this very sort of flattering image. And this is what was produced as a popular print of the Lincoln family, who were, not only were they never photographed together, Val, they were seldom together. Robert was at Harvard and at Harvard Law. He wrote he never had 10 minutes alone with his father during the entire war. Willie died 11 months into the presidency. And Mary said she was fortunate if Lincoln came to the bedroom to talk about the events of the day at 11 o'clock at night. So the Civil War drove them apart. It did not bring them together. This picture was meant to say they were together, maybe to reassure Americans that Lincoln had had a happy and united family life.
And Carpenter, the painter, never really got the credit that he deserved for originating that powerful idea of showing a public man in
No, and he
private
not only,
sphere.
and this, the ultimate indignity was that he did get $500 for it, but he claimed he only sold the physical the intellectual property. He still owned the physical canvas. However, the Buttra studio went bankrupt eventually and sold it to a New Yorker named Warren Crane, and he and Carpenter was not happy. Crane had him come to his house to see it, but not to return it to him. And it was Crane who gave it to the Historical Society years later.
We're very
Carpenter
lucky.
always said he was going to add color, and that was his ploy to get it back, but he didn't, and he didn't.
And he didn't. Let's move on to our next artistic work. And this is an etching by Aldebert Johann Volk, writing the Emancipation Proclamation, 1863. So we're at the middle of the second year of the Civil War. It was getting difficult for the Confederacy to circulate morale-building artworks depicting military heroes or battlefield triumphs. And that was for one practical reason. Most of the able-bodied artists were fighting in the war as soldiers. So actually, this is an interesting thing to contemplate right now as sculptural monuments to the Confederacy are being pulled down. There were none that were done at the time of the Civil War, no artistic works. So tell us about this fellow Volk, the artist who created this etching.
So he's also a hyphenated American, born in Bavaria. Unlike most of the Germans who came to the United States after the revolutions of 1848 failed in Europe, he was an arch conservative and a racist, not an anti-slavery man. He settled in Baltimore, and the surroundings and the environment make the man in a way. He was a dentist by trade, and was obviously a very gifted draftsman. And he made these series of anti-Union, pro-Confederate etchings throughout the Civil War and published them secretly with a fake London copyright. Baltimore was occupied quite early in the war by the Union, and artists like Volk were, printmakers were shut down who sympathized with the Confederacy. So Volk was operating in total secret. He was not influential at the time, but venomous toward Lincoln. And look at this, unlike Carpenter, who portrayed Lincoln writing, almost as a divine presence, this Lincoln is writing the Emancipation Proclamation from an inkwell that's held by Satan, and he's got his foot on the Holy Bible to do it. Look at the cloved, or the devil's heads on the table. There's liquor on a cabinet on the table nearby, because if he wasn't influenced by the devil, he had to be drunk. There's a picture of John Brown as Saint John Brown. So John Brown is the evil influence over Lincoln. There's a painting of a slave rebellion in Haiti. And the unusual, the figure that looks like a baboon right over Lincoln is actually the statuette of Columbia, the symbol of the country. But pulled over its head is the kind of Scottish tam that Lincoln allegedly wore to escape notice on his trip to Baltimore. So it's a very inside joke there, but clearly not very favorable toward the proclamation.
Not at all. But this is part of a series called Sketches from the Civil War in North America. Some of the other images in that series also depict something fake newsy, I think, in a way.
Yeah, I mean, cave life in Vicksburg, I think we've shown that one. That was Volk. Southern women melting church bells to make cannon for their holy cause. But lots of anti-Lincoln stuff. Lincoln and General Benjamin Butler as Don Quixote and Sancho Panza. Lincoln sneaking into Baltimore.
But it's interesting you should mention Lincoln and Volk, because apparently Volk had a change of heart after Lincoln's assassination, or did he?
So he said, right? He said he always regretted that he was ever mean to that lovely man. But, he painted, he went on to paint, but his paintings were of Robert E. Lee and Lee mourning Stonewall Jackson. He did Confederate-inspired paintings. He never did a Lincoln painting that showed any kind of, you know, sense of having regretted what he did.
Yeah, yeah. Let's move on to our next image. And this is also a large painting, not quite as large as Return of the 69. This is called An Episode of War, The Cavalry Charge of Lieutenant Henry B. Hidden, by an artist named Victor Nelig.
No, we called it a hidden treasure in the book. I know that's kind of a pun I have to keep apologizing for. But
it's cute. But anyway, it is a dramatic scene, so we don't want to minimize it.
Right.
And this is Henry Hidden was a youthful, well-connected New Yorker. Tell us a bit about him and this particular episode of war.
Well, he was a very young man, 23-year-old, when he joined Company H of the 1st New York Cavalry. Yes, there were cavalry units from New York. And he, a brave young guy, he led his, I should say he was his family were very wealthy shipbuilders, the Webb family. So he was New York mercantile royalty, to be sure. And he led his men into Virginia, and one day at a place called Sangster's Station, he saw an unguarded, exposed flank of General Joe Johnston's Confederate army, and he just led his cavalry and broke through and created havoc and really pushed them back. Unfortunately, in the midst of the charge, and that's what this scene is supposed to represent. You see, his head is not held upright, and that's because he's just been shot through the neck, and he is going to fall forward and die.
But it is kind of remarkable. I mean, it doesn't diminish the dramatic nature of the canvas, but it was a relatively obscure incident, even in its own time. Why was it obscure?
Well, first of all, this little skirmish was not a major battle. Second of all, there were two major events going on the same day: the Monitor and Merrimack battle and the Battle of Pea Ridge in the West, which were much more important and much more well covered by the media, of course. This could have led to a battle, but Johnston's army recouped and just waited for another day. But as you mentioned, Val, when we started, the Webb family was wealthy, and they wanted to remember their relative, and who was called Harry. In fact, the original title of this painting is much more dramatic: the gallant charge of Lieutenant Harry Hidden. I don't know why they changed it to An Episode of the War, but it was commissioned by the family and displayed in regiments for years. He's considered one of the, I doubt this because this is 1862. He's considered the first Union cavalry officer to die during the war. I'm not sure that's possible, but we'll go with it for now. And you know what I neglected to mention? If we could think back to Colonel Corcoran again, and it's okay to make this point now. Corcoran did get out of prison, our Irish Brigade hero. He got out of prison, he recovered, he went back into the service, and ignominiously, he was killed when his horse fell on him. So what the Battle of Bull Run could not do to Colonel Corcoran. I don't like horses. I know lots of people do. They petrify me, so all power to Henry Hidden for doing all this.
Yes, I mean, that is, Henry Hidden's claim to fame is the first Union cavalry officer killed in action, sort of like our Zouave guy last week.
Yeah.
But
yes.
Yes.
Oh, Ellsworth. I think Ellsworth gets it. Yeah.
He gets it. Yeah.
He gets the honor.
So you do mention, though, that this painting casts a new light on the harsh realities of war. What are some of the details that stand out for you?
Well, the first images of war were pretty bucolic, even though the landscape is turning red, as others have put it. But this is really hand-to-hand combat. It's swords, it's bayonets, it's rifles, it's confusion, it's trees shorn of leaves. It's not romantic at all. It's tough, and it's scary. And you've got these foreign-born artists who are really revising the idea of war. And so far, I think we've done all, except for Carpenter, they're all foreign-born artists. And they are, of course, America was kind of speaking with a foreign accent at the time anyway. They say 40% of the Union Army spoke with some kind of a foreign accent, which is remarkable.
It is remarkable. So we're down to our last of 5 artworks or artistic impressions of war.
Right.
And this is point lookout sketches. These are watercolor drawings by John Jacob Omenhauser. And during the 4 years of the Civil War, about 212,000 Confederates and 463,000 Union men were taken prisoner. And a majority of these were actually imprisoned for the duration of the war. For those of those men who were strong enough to endure the starvation and exposure, sickness, and all around hellish circumstances, we've learned that creativity helped them survive.
Yeah.
So the artist of these sketches, John Jacob Omenhauser, was one such soldier. Tell us a bit about him.
Well, what we know is he was, I'm assuming he was foreign born, but certainly German American in some way. He was a folk artist and a candy maker before the war, confectioner he was called. Austrian by descent, settled in Baltimore, and went up early and saw some action in the 1st Richmond Light Artillery. But he survived in the war for some time, but it caught up with him in 1864. And he was captured at Petersburg and imprisoned at a hot and steamy camp on the southern shore of Maryland called Point Lookout, where at its peak, 20,000 men were kept in pretty tough circumstances in about 23 acres. So it wasn't really as crowded as Andersonville or Elmira, but a pretty tough situation. And by the way, prisoners were exchanged at the beginning of the war, but by 1864, General Grant had said no more exchanges because imprisoned soldiers hurt the Confederate side more than ours because we can always replenish. But Omenhauser was gifted. I think he probably sold some of these to fellow prisoners because we have evidence that some of them wrote home saying there's a very clever artist here. And you see he's a folk artist at best. He was captured by a black soldier, by the way. And he does, what makes his pieces remarkable is that he shows African-American soldiers guarding him, which for a Southerner must have been a deep kind of humiliation, which we feel is nice retribution at this point.
I think we actually have that in the next slide. It's interesting too, because he was so, he painted so many artworks, and it's such a huge body of work that it was thought it was the work of more than one person, but it seems to just be his. And at New York Historical Society, the art collection is a portfolio of 40 watercolors, and here just a kind of a selection of them. What did they depict, just in general? There are so many.
Well, it depicts African-American guard selling some extras to a prisoner, maybe a potato or an extra ration. And on the left, it shows a group of ladies who are touring the camp as if it's a tourist attraction. And you've got a soldier kind of uninhibitedly bare-chested washing his shirt, which is bug infested. And he's saying to the ladies, "Why is this camp so lousy?" Which I think even then had a double meaning. So they all have voice boxes what do you call it? Minstrel dialect for the African Americans. But as this soldier says, the bottom rail is on top now, which is about the summation of Omenhauser's existence. the African American guards are in control. So it's society's turned upside down for him.
Yeah.
And he was in prison until, not only was he in prison until the end of the war, he was in prison until 2 months after the war. He wasn't let go. He would not sign the loyalty oath that was required of prisoners to be demobbed, and as a result, you know, he moved back to Richmond, married, became a candy maker again, died young of cancer, but I don't think his mind was expanded by the experience.
Well, certainly our artistic impressions of the experience, or his artistic expressions, do endure, and that is a wonderful thing. So we're ready for our Q&A, and our first question is, and we do see a slide of all of the objects together again. Did Lincoln ever see the Volk etching, and if so, what was his reaction?
Excellent question. We have no idea. I would suspect not. Again, although many claims have been made about the popularity and influence of Adalbert Volk in his time, I've never believed it. I think that there was such strict censorship in Union-occupied Baltimore in 1863 and 4, and until the end of the war, that his works would not have circulated. Although the New York Historical Society copy has a really early acquisition date, as I recall. So, but there's no evidence. He saw plenty of nasty caricature in his day, but no evidence that he saw Volk.
Next question. One of our viewers this evening believes that Lincoln's foot is on the Constitution. Is that correct?
No, it really is the Bible. A close-up, if you look at a close-up of that image, he helps us by saying Bible.
Okay, good. So you would know the answer to this better than I. How many other paintings and prints of the Civil War are there in the Society's collection?
Oh, you're putting this on me, Val.
Well, you looked through hundreds. I mean, there are literally
I would say there
hundreds.
are certainly dozens and dozens. And we're going to see a nice Grant portrait next week, which we're saving for our Grant-focused penultimate session. So some nice military portraits and some interesting pre-war paintings, including a lovely painting of an African-American man thinking of emancipation, and Eastman Johnson paintings that are pre-war but very important in depicting slavery in Washington, D.C. before the war. It's a great collection. And I don't even know what's in the storerooms, by the way.
Exactly. And in the print room alone, there are just so many prints to choose from, and in duplicate, triplicate, multiple impressions of sometimes the same image. So I would put it at least in the hundreds, if not maybe thousands. So
with a print collection and photographs, definitely
exactly,
thousands, yeah.
Exactly. Was Lincoln mistrustful of the Irish 69th since they were Democrats?
No, certainly not at the beginning. He worked very hard to get ethnic regiments and ethnic generals. Front Sigel among the Germans, and Corcoran was the poster boy for Irish patriotism. When things began to get a little rough is in terms of his relationship with the Irish American community and Irish American voters, is when the Emancipation Proclamation was issued and the rationale for the war expanded from just preserving the Union to eradicating slavery as well. Not that Lincoln had illusions that he had political supporters in the Irish community. He knew that the Irish were Democrats, but in 1861, he did not want the fight against secession to be a Republican war only. So he was willing to accept all parties, all ethnicities in the service.
Next question, and I think, well, I know the answer to this one. You said the Return of the 69th was exhibited at the Knoedler Gallery on 9th Avenue. It actually was 9th Street, right?
Oh, Ninth Street. Oh, excuse me. Okay,
That's
good.
okay. Well, because our viewer says the far west side of Manhattan was a wasteland, which it was, and there were
Probably
slaughterhouses.
landfill. Okay, good correction. Thank you.
Okay. So yeah, there was no art gallery over there. I was surprised to hear that it was on 9th Street, actually.
Well,
I grew
it
up
was
right around there.
the Goupil Gallery, the old, and
Yeah,
Knoedler took it over. I
right.
guess I was thinking Ninth Avenue because of all the Chelsea art galleries now.
Exactly. Were painting presentations different in the 19th century?
Painting presentation.
Presentations. I'm wondering what that
Yeah,
if
I'm
there's
not
any.
sure.
Yeah,
I'm not sure I know what it means. I mean, I will say
yeah,
that that their unveilings, if we
yeah,
take the literal sense, were certainly big deals. And in
yeah.
the years after the war, much fanfare attended the unveiling of paintings. And as you point out, Val, much of the Civil War statuary was, except for Lincoln statuary, was done from 1890 on, when there was enough money in the South to collect for those enormous commissions. But so painting unveilings were big, and there were lots of veterans who loved having those reminders around, and there were lots of veterans, and even Robert E. Lee, who didn't think there should be any Civil War paintings or art of any kind. He just wanted there to be no visual records that glorified war, which is interesting when we think about the people who are insisting that his statues endure.
Exactly. Uh, what, if any, was the relationship between the Irish 69th and the 1863 draft rioters?
They were back in service at Gettysburg, and the troops that were drawn from the ranks of the Army of the Potomac at Gettysburg, mostly those who were fairly well rested and not been engaged in much of the battle, were the ones who were brought back to quell the riots. I have not checked into the psychology or the response of the veterans or those serving in the 69th and their attitudes toward the draft riots. I would suspect that they were repelled by them because they were a proud and organized brigade and still fighting for the Union.
Although, as we noted in that episode, many of the draft rioters were in fact Irish. So there's that connection too, which
Yeah,
must be very
absolutely. But
fraught.
they were the Irish who did not want to enlist or be drafted, as opposed to the 69th who would enlisted.
Okay. Next question: How did so many paintings from the Civil War era survive?
Well, they were preserved by their original patrons, mostly Union leagues, armories, regimental headquarters, clubhouses, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, the Sons of Confederate Veterans, all of these organizations that championed these mementos and commissioned them and paid for them and held their meetings in front of them. Those of you who have seen the 7th Regiment Armory, it's filled with Civil War art, and indeed art from other American conflicts. Army and Navy clubs all over the country. So that they were preserved because they were put into institutional settings really early. Not many were done for private collectors, and that's why they survived.
And one such painting, the Nellig painting, which is up there on the right. How accurate is that painting, and are they all real characters that are depicted in it?
Yeah, my understanding is that some portraits were based on survivors, and that inevitably the cavalry charged is based on descriptions of the survivors that the artist was privy to, collected by the family for his use. But obviously there is no photography of the war at that point. There is photography, but it's not action photography. So most of this, again, we said earlier, or I said it wasn't romanticized, but it's somewhat invented. It's just not a very pleasant glorification.
uh, we're back to Lincoln. We're in your
Good,
wheelhouse
safe,
with
safe
this
ground,
question.
yeah.
Did he enjoy art? And were there many American art museums during his life?
Yeah, there weren't many. The big breakthrough for American art museums is 1870, 5 years after the war, when the Metropolitan, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and the Art Institute of Chicago are all founded. But there were plenty of galleries. Lincoln was not an habitué of art galleries, to be sure. And he always commented that he was a very indifferent judge of artistic matters, mostly in relation to critiquing pictures of himself that he was compelled to praise or acknowledge when they were being painted. On the other hand, he let artists and sculptors have their go at him a lot during the war. You'd think he'd be otherwise engaged, and he was busy, and he never sat still like George Washington did for Gilbert Stuart. He had to be painted on the jump, as he put it, while he was working, usually on his correspondence. But he allowed them entree, and he was very solicitous. He liked joking with artists. He let Carpenter hang out in the state dining room for 6 months, painting the Emancipation painting and other pictures. I will say that one exception I know of was when the first major painting of Ulysses S. Grant was brought to the Capitol for display, and Lincoln was invited to see it. And he had not met Grant up to that point. And I think part of him felt obliged to pay tribute to him. And another part of him said, if I don't go pay homage at this painting, people are going to think I'm afraid of Grant running for president. So he went up to Capitol Hill to look at it. And that may be the only painting I know about, not of himself, that he had a gander at during the Civil War. He liked the Emancipation Proclamation painting. He told Carpenter, it's as good as it can get. The portraiture is perfect.
But to the follow-up question, were there any American art museums during Lincoln's life? Yes, in fact, 1870, very important year
And the
for
New York
American
Historical
art.
Society was,
I
of
was
course,
just
in
going to
operation,
say,
right?
yes,
I don't know what
1804.
we don't know, or I don't know what the installations were like during the war, but I'll bet there were some,
Yeah,
and
that's
there were
true.
the National Academy of Design was operating during the war, and every season they would hang paintings, and we know from the records that these included war paintings. So that's kind of like a museum.
That's right. So New York Historical founded 1804 as a museum and a library. So, but very different from the museums as colossal encyclopedic museums like the Met that we know. Another Lincoln question for you, Harold. Did Lincoln ever visit any of the prisons? Was he concerned about the conditions?
He visited camp hospitals. That would be as close as he got to seeing Confederates who were under restraint. So he famously, when he went to visit the wounded at campsites, he would make to the tents that contained the Confederate prisoners, and he would often say, well, they would recognize him, and he would extend his hand and said, "I will shake your hand if you will shake mine." And almost always they were drawn to him and took his hand. And so he didn't visit prisoner of war camps, to my knowledge, but he did visit hospital camps where the wounded were as good as imprisoned.
We're up to our last question now. Are you aware of any African American artists who depicted this era?
Yeah, there were some. One, and I hate to go back to Lincoln as my fallback, but there was a painter named David Bowser who painted Lincoln and other scenes. So yes, there were African American artists at work. Not many, but Lincoln was a particularly evocative and attractive subject. So he did attract at least Bowser and others. William Matthew Pryor was another African American artist who painted Lincoln. And I'm sure there were wartime artists, battle artists as well.
Well, it looks like we're out of time. Harold, thank you once again for your wonderful insights and anecdotes, for being such a great partner in this series. And thank you to our audience for being with us and for your support. Good night.
Good night.